I never thought I'd get this worked up over tomatoes, but there I was, coffee in hand, staring at an empty planter box on my front porch like someone had stolen a part of me. They weren't just tomatoes. They were my escape from the grind, my late-night therapy after long days stuck at a desk job I hated. Those bright red fruits were a reminder that I could still grow something with my own two hands. And now, they were gone. Again. At first, I told myself it was animals. Raccoons, squirrels, maybe some rogue birds. But deep down, I knew better. We lived in a tidy suburban neighborhood with more HOA rules than common sense, and raccoons usually didn't come dressed in pastel cardigans and pearls. I had a good idea who was behind it. Karen, the self-appointed queen of our HOA. The same woman who sent violation notices if your grass was half an inch too tall. I had caught her snooping around more than once, but I never expected outright theft. What I didn't know was that catching her would set off a chain reaction I could never have predicted, and that a single Carolina Reaper could change everything. I never expected gardening to save me, not in the big dramatic sense of the word, but in the slow, quiet way that creeps up on you without notice. The steady routine of digging my hands into the dirt, coaxing life out of seeds no bigger than a grain of sand, there was peace in that. After years of staring at spreadsheets until my vision blurred, of meetings that dragged on until they blurred into each other, I found something honest in planting tomatoes. They didn't demand answers or deadlines. They just grew as long as you tended them. After the divorce, I needed something to keep me tethered. I wasn't the guy who ran marathons to burn through grief. I didn't take up pottery or yoga. I planted tomatoes, cherry, heirloom, beefsteak, rows of them, thick vines curling up in cages I bent into shape with my own hands. I spent weekends out there, boots scuffing the soft soil, my fingers stained green. And they thrived. I was proud of that. It was the one thing in my life I hadn't messed up lately. Our neighborhood, Willow Bend, was one of those places where everything looked like a staged photo. Perfect lawns, shutters painted the right shade of beige, flower beds that matched the season. It was neat, predictable, and heavily patrolled by the HOA, led by Karen, a woman who treated her title like royalty. Karen was the kind of person who smiled while she fined you. She always wore pastel yoga pants and zip-up jackets, her hair pulled so tight it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of polite disapproval. If your grass grew too long, she noticed. If your trash cans weren't rolled in by 5, she wrote you up. And if you had tomato cages that didn't match the community aesthetic, she let you know. I'd had a few run-ins with Karen before, mostly about things like the color of my mailbox or the fact that my porch light wasn't in harmony with the rest of the block. But when I caught her staring at my tomato plants during one of her morning inspections, something in her gaze stuck with me. I thought maybe she was jealous or annoyed I wasn't planting petunias like the HOA preferred. The first time the tomatoes went missing, I figured it was animals, raccoons maybe. I shrugged it off, replanted. But when it happened again, and there wasn't a single footprint in the soft dirt, my suspicion grew. Karen made another offhand comment during her rounds, something about messy gardening and unapproved structures, pointing a manicured finger at my cages. I smiled and nodded, but something churned behind my ribs. That evening, I set up a camera, tucked it low, where it could catch whoever was helping themselves. I told myself it was just curiosity, but deep down, I knew better. I didn't know it yet, but this wasn't going to stay quiet. It was just after 5 in the morning when my phone buzzed. I wasn't even awake yet, not really. I'd fallen asleep on the couch again, a half-finished glass of whiskey still sweating on the coffee table. The notification glowed bright in the dark room. Motion detected, front garden. My pulse jumped, suddenly wide awake. I rubbed my face, thumbed open the app, and squinted at the grainy night footage. At first, it was just shapes, blurry gray shadows shifting against the dark. And then she stepped into view. Karen. I sat there, stunned, watching her move across my front yard like she was in a low-budget heist movie. She was dressed for the part too, at least if you were casting the most ridiculous cat burglar in history. Pink Crocs. A pastel hoodie zipped up tight over yoga pants. Garden gloves pulled high on her wrists like she was handling toxic waste. And on her head, a wide-brimmed sun hat tilted low over her face, as if that made her invisible. I felt something bubble up inside me. Not quite rage, not yet. Something closer to disbelief, tangled up in bitter amusement. She moved with this bizarre combination of stealth and entitlement, tiptoeing across my flower beds with exaggerated care while glancing around like someone might catch her. She was carrying a little reusable shopping bag, the kind you get at the farmer's market, and without hesitation, she reached down and plucked one of my best tomatoes straight off the vine. No hesitation, no guilt. Just slipped it into the bag, patted it gently like it was something precious, and went for another. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, staring at the screen. It was surreal. I'd expected, I don't know, maybe a raccoon, some hungry neighborhood kid. But Karen, who lectured me on HOA landscaping ordinances and measured the height of my grass with a ruler, she was the one stealing my tomatoes? There was something deeply ridiculous about it. She even checked her watch halfway through, like she had somewhere important to be after robbing me blind. And then, after stuffing 3, no, 4, perfectly ripe tomatoes into her bag, she adjusted her hat, smoothed down her hoodie, and strutted back toward the sidewalk like she hadn't just committed petty theft. I sat back, the weight of it hitting me. I had proof, real, undeniable proof. There she was, Karen in full color, or at least black and white night vision, stealing from me. Now what? I spent the rest of that morning in a haze, replaying the footage on my phone until the battery gave out. Part of me wanted to march across the street and confront her right then and there. Stand on her perfectly manicured lawn, knock on her door with the video queued up, and demand an explanation. Maybe throw in a threat to take it to the board or the police, or whoever handled vegetable-based crimes in suburban purgatory. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wouldn't change a thing. Karen wouldn't apologize. She'd twist the whole thing into some HOA-sanctioned rule about how my tomatoes were technically an eyesore, or communal property, because they were visible from the sidewalk. She was slick that way. Rules were just tools in her hands. And if I escalated it, if I made it official, I knew exactly how it would play out. Fines, letters, petty revenge hidden behind bylaws and formal language. She would win. She always did. No, I needed something better. I sat on the couch long after the sun came up, half listening to the hum of the neighborhood waking up, sprinklers turning on, garage doors lifting, kids waiting for the school bus. I scrolled through my phone without thinking. That's when I found it. One of those viral videos with some poor idiot on camera, sweating through his shirt, face red as a fire engine. Carolina Reaper, challenge. I watched as the guy took a bite of a tiny wrinkled red pepper, chewed it, and then immediately regretted every choice he'd ever made. He gagged, coughed, and scrambled off screen for water that wasn't coming fast enough. I watched the whole thing twice, and then a third time. By the 4th playthrough, I was grinning. The kind of grin I hadn't felt in years. Tight, satisfied. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and drove straight to the gardening center. The cashier was maybe 19. He rang up the Carolina Reaper seedlings with a bored look on his face, then glanced at me like he was about to offer some kind of professional concern. "You know these are crazy hot, right?" he asked. "That's the point," I said. He gave me a long look, like he was wondering whether to call someone, but in the end, he bagged them up and handed them over. I walked out of that store feeling lighter than I had in weeks, maybe months. It was time to fight fire with fire. The air was heavy that afternoon, thick with the kind of heat that clings to your skin and makes every movement feel slow. But I didn't mind. I was focused. There was a quiet sort of satisfaction in the work, and as I crouched beside my raised beds, I let myself sink into it. The Carolina Reapers were small, but there was a certain menace to them even at this size. Their leaves were darker than my tomato plants, their stems a little more rigid. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you wouldn't notice. But I did, and I took my time arranging them, planting them just deep enough that their roots could take hold, careful to blend them seamlessly among the vines of my cherry tomatoes and beefsteaks. I kept thinking of those spy movies I watched as a kid, the ones where someone plants a bug under a desk or slips a key card from a pocket without anyone noticing. That's how this felt. Precision. Patience. I was laying a trap, and every handful of soil I pressed down over those roots made the plan feel more real. By the time I finished, I stood back and looked over my work. To anyone walking by, it was still the same tidy row of tomato plants, supported by my bent wire cages, leaning toward the sun. But I knew better. Hidden among them were a handful of small, innocent-looking pods that would make any thief seriously regret their choices. I wiped my hands on my jeans and took a breath. And just like that, the waiting game began. Karen made her rounds 2 days later, like clockwork. She strutted down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, Princess, the world's most judgmental poodle, trotting along at her side. I watched from the porch, pretending to scroll through my phone as she paused at the edge of my property. Her eyes did their usual scan, left to right, top to bottom, the same as always. Only this time, they lingered on the garden just a little longer. Her mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You know," she said, loud enough for me to hear, "those cages are still non-compliant, and you really should consider trimming back. It's starting to look unruly." I looked up, gave her a polite nod. "Thanks for the feedback." She sniffed, made a note on her clipboard that I was sure was some fabricated violation, and kept walking. I waited until she was halfway down the street before muttering under my breath, "If only you knew." The waiting was the worst part. Every evening after work and dinner, and whatever half-hearted attempt I made to pass as a functioning adult, I'd settle into my spot by the window with my phone in one hand and a cup of cold coffee in the other. The camera feed streamed quietly on the screen, black and white and grainy, but clear enough for what I needed. I sat there in the dark, curtains drawn just enough, watching, listening. The first night, I was wired tight, barely blinking. Every rustle of the wind sent my pulse racing. The shadows stretched and shifted, making every tree branch look suspicious. Once, just before midnight, I caught a flicker of movement by the garden gate. I leaned forward so fast I nearly dropped the phone. But it wasn't Karen. It was a possum waddling through, uninterested in anything except the overturned compost bin at the edge of the yard. False alarm. The second night, it was Jerry's dog. The stupid thing somehow squeezed through the hole in their fence again. I watched it sniff around my tomatoes, its nose twitching, tail wagging. For a second, I thought I was about to witness an accidental tragedy, but the dog seemed smart enough to back away from the reapers. I made a mental note to give Jerry a heads up. By the end of the week, I'd memorized the exact moments when the sprinkler system clicked on, the way the shadows shifted as the streetlights buzzed to life, even the rhythm of the neighborhood raccoons making their rounds. It was starting to feel obsessive. Hell, maybe it was obsessive. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. And I was patient. Sort of. On the 8th night, I sat in the dark, legs stiff, back aching from hours of waiting. The camera feed showed nothing but stillness, save for the faint flicker of moths near the lens. I sighed and leaned back, rubbing the bridge of my nose. Maybe she'd figured me out. Maybe she'd moved on to stealing from someone else's garden. Maybe I'd lost my mind planting what was essentially a tiny collection of edible hand grenades. But I wasn't giving up. I glanced down at the phone again. Nothing. Good things come to those who wait. It was close to midnight when my phone buzzed. At first I thought it was another false alarm, probably Jerry's dog again, or maybe the wind tripping the motion sensor like it had a dozen times before. Still, I opened the app, more out of habit than anything else, already expecting another empty screen. But there was movement this time. Real movement. Someone was creeping through the garden gate. I leaned forward, my heart quickening. The figure was hunched, moving slow, cautious in that way people get when they know they shouldn't be where they are. For a split second I thought it was Karen. Same sort of careful steps, same weird, I'm totally not doing anything wrong energy. But then the figure got closer, and the camera's night vision sharpened the image just enough. Too lanky, too young. Hoodie pulled up over messy hair. A teenager. I let out a slow breath, watching as he darted between the planter boxes. I recognized him. Tommy, I think. Lived 2 houses down. He was the kind of kid who skateboarded at all hours of the night and never made eye contact with anyone. Not a bad kid, but not exactly respectful of boundaries either. He moved fast, reaching for one of the plants near the front. His hand hovered for a second, then grabbed the biggest, brightest reaper hanging low on the vine. He plucked it like he knew exactly what he was after, like he'd done this before. No hesitation, no clue. I sat there, holding my breath as he brought it up to his mouth and took a huge, oblivious bite. It was almost instant. First came the freeze. His whole body went stiff, the way you do when your brain short-circuits and it takes a second to realize what's happening. Then the panic. He spat what was left of the pepper onto the ground and clawed at his mouth, stumbling backward into one of the tomato cages. The thing toppled over with a loud clatter, and for a second I thought he was going to take down the entire row. He made this noise, half gag, half scream, that I was pretty sure woke up half the block. Then he bolted for my garden hose, tripping twice before turning the nozzle the wrong way and blasting himself full in the face. I shouldn't have laughed. I really shouldn't have. But I did. Quietly at first, then harder when he dumped the entire bucket of rainwater I'd left by the compost over his head, like he was in some desperate version of the ice bucket challenge. After a minute, he staggered off, wiping his mouth on his sleeve and muttering curses I couldn't quite make out. I felt bad, a little, but mostly I knew the bait worked. It happened 2 days later, right when I was starting to wonder if I'd pushed things too far. After the incident with the teenager, I'd tightened up the garden. No more easy pickings. I repositioned the reapers, made the whole setup look a little less inviting, but I kept the trap armed, just in case. And then, like she was on some kind of HOA appointed schedule, Karen showed up. It was late afternoon, the kind of heat-heavy day that made the whole neighborhood seem quieter than usual. I was out back, pretending to fix one of the fence posts, but really, I was watching. I always was now. Karen came down the sidewalk with her usual purpose, Princess trotting beside her like a little puffball of judgment. She stopped at my gate and lingered longer than necessary, like she was debating something. I wiped my hands on my jeans, feeling that prick of anticipation crawl up my spine. She opened the gate. She never did that. Karen was a lingerer, a judger, but never a trespasser, at least not when people were watching. But this time, she slipped inside like it was her God-given right. Her hand hovered over the vines, fingers grazing leaves, almost tender. If I hadn't known better, I'd have thought she was admiring them. I stayed still, watching from behind the fence. My heart was pounding so loud, I swore she'd hear it. She reached for one of the reapers. I wanted to shout, to stop her, to warn her. But I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched as she plucked it from the vine, held it up to the light like she was inspecting a jewel, and gave the faintest nod of approval. Then she bit into it. No hesitation. Like she'd done this a dozen times before. The effect was immediate and, frankly, better than I ever imagined. Her face didn't just flush. It blazed. Her mouth opened in a silent scream before she dropped the half-eaten pepper to the ground and clawed at her tongue like it was covered in fire ants. She stumbled backward, tripped over the edge of the planter box, and landed square on her backside in the dirt. Princess barked once, sharp and confused, as Karen scrambled to her feet, tears streaming down her cheeks, mascara smudging like a raccoon caught in a rainstorm. She ran for the hose next, spraying water wildly into the air, half of it hitting her face, the rest soaking her hair and clothes. If it wasn't so shocking, it might have been art, pure slapstick poetry. I stood there, watching in stunned silence. My hands were shaking, not from guilt or fear, but from the sheer glorious disbelief of it all. And for a moment, I thought that was it. That was the end. Karen, broken by a single angry pepper. I was wrong. It wasn't. The calm didn't last long. I should have known better. Karen wasn't the type to take a hit and walk away, even if her mouth was still probably blistered from that Carolina Reaper. If anything, I think the burn only made her meaner. 2 days after the incident, I found the first letter taped to my front door. Bright orange, impossible to miss. Official HOA warning. Failure to maintain approved vegetation. I stood there staring at it, coffee cooling in my hand, reading the same sentence 3 times over. My garden was now classified as unsightly and out of compliance. There was a fine, of course, $100 for the first violation. I laughed because it was either that or throw the cup across the lawn. The next day there were 2 letters. One was another fine, this time for hazardous plant material, whatever that meant. The second was a formal notice to appear at an HOA hearing for public safety concerns. I almost admired the speed. Karen was working fast, efficient, even by her standards. By the end of the week, it was 4 letters and a stack of fines thick enough to slap down on the counter with a thud. The language got more aggressive with each one. They accused me of growing dangerous flora, of maintaining an unsafe environment that posed a risk to the community. There was even a line about willful endangerment, which made me laugh harder than I should have. It sounded like I was running a backyard meth lab, not growing peppers. The gossip started next. It always did. I caught snippets when I walked to the mailbox, heads turning a little quicker than usual when I passed by. Mrs. Becker across the street avoided eye contact completely, which was new. Jerry, at least, still gave me a nod when I saw him dragging his trash cans in. But even he looked a little uneasy. "They're saying you tried to poison her," he told me one evening. His voice was low, like we were conspiring. I smiled. "She stole from me." He shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Karen's telling everyone you're reckless, dangerous." That was the word, dangerous. It was spreading. I could feel it in the way neighbors I'd lived next to for years wouldn't quite meet my eye anymore. Karen had recovered, and she was coming for me the only way she knew how, through the rules, through the HOA. The game was on. The envelope came on a Wednesday. Official HOA notice hand-delivered and slipped under my door like some kind of eviction threat. I found it sitting there on the welcome mat, the HOA logo stamped across the top like a warning label. Inside was the summons written in that overly formal tone Karen loved so much. Community hearing. Unsafe gardening practices. Mandatory attendance required. It was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at the community center. Of course it was. Karen knew how to pick the perfect time, right when most people would be home, right when she could get an audience. She wanted the neighbors gathered, whispering in folding chairs, hanging on every word, while she spun her side of the story. She didn't just want to punish me. She wanted to make an example out of me. I should have been angry. Part of me was, but mostly I felt something else. A strange kind of calm, like that moment right before a storm breaks, when the air is heavy and still, and you know something's coming, but you're not sure if you should run or stand your ground. I stood my ground. The days leading up to the hearing, I went back through the security footage. Not just the night Karen took the Reaper, though I had that queued up and ready to go, but everything. Every time she walked by and stared at my plants like they offended her. Every time she made a snide comment about my cages, or the vines spilling over the edges of the planters, and most importantly, every single second she spent on my property without permission. By Friday night, I had an entire highlight reel ready. Theft, trespassing, that glorious moment when she bit into the Reaper and ran for the hose like her life depended on it. The footage didn't lie, and I was done playing nice. Still, I couldn't help but feel the nerves creeping in as I packed up my laptop and printed out copies of the HOA's own bylaws. It wasn't just about proving my innocence. It was about surviving Karen's machine. She'd spent years perfecting her role as the neighborhood's queen of compliance. This was her arena, her game. But this time, I wasn't walking in empty-handed. She wanted a show. I'd give her one. Saturday came heavy and hot, the kind of afternoon where the air hangs thick and no one really wants to be outside. But that didn't stop them. By the time I got to the community center, people were already filing in, their polite conversations edged with something sharper, the kind of tension you could feel under your skin. This wasn't just another HOA meeting about recycling bins or acceptable porch decorations. This was something else. Some of the neighbors glanced my way as I walked through the door. Some nodded, some didn't. Mrs. Becker turned away, pretending she was studying the pamphlet on HOA regulations, like it was a sacred text. Mr. Jenkins gave me a tight smile, then busied himself with adjusting his baseball cap. Jerry, at least, was there near the back, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He gave me a thumbs up as I passed by, and for a second, I let myself believe this might not be a complete disaster. Karen was already seated at the front of the room, of course, clipboard in hand, reading glasses perched halfway down her nose, a stack of neatly arranged papers in front of her like some kind of courtroom drama. She didn't look at me when I walked in, but she didn't have to. That smug little smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, like she already knew how this was going to end. I found a seat near Jerry, close enough to see everyone, far enough back to keep some distance. Margaret, the HOA secretary, sat near Karen, as usual, but as she glanced up from her notes, our eyes met. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod before returning to her papers. It wasn't much, but it was something. The room filled quickly. Folding chairs scraped across the floor as people settled in, fanning themselves with whatever papers they had. The murmur of conversation swirled, little pockets of gossip popping like bubbles. I caught pieces as they floated past. I heard he poisoned her garden. Dangerous plants. You'd think he'd have more sense. She stole from him, though, didn't she? The sides were forming. Karen's loyalists, the ones who clung to the HOA rules like life jackets, sat together near the front, their arms crossed, expressions tight, but others hung back, the quiet ones. People like Jerry, people who'd gotten those orange violation notices in the past, who knew exactly how Karen operated but had never said a word, until now. I sat there, feeling the weight of it. This wasn't just about tomatoes anymore. This was about how far someone like Karen could go before someone finally pushed back. The room was packed, more people than I'd seen at any HOA meeting before. Neighbors who normally avoided these things like the plague now sat shoulder to shoulder, murmuring behind their hands or pretending to scroll through their phones, waiting for the show to start. And that's exactly what it was, a show. Karen sat at the head of the room, like royalty presiding over a trial. Oversized sunglasses covered half her face, but they didn't hide the band of redness across her cheeks or the faint puffiness around her eyes. Whether it was from the reaper or the drama, I couldn't say. She had her pastel cardigan draped just so over her shoulders, like she'd planned the whole outfit to strike the right balance of delicate and dignified. In front of her, a stack of papers neatly fanned out. Every page no doubt covered in legal-sounding threats and HOA jargon. She cleared her throat into the microphone. The feedback whined for a second before settling. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice thin and full of false bravery. "This isn't easy for me. As many of you know, I've always worked hard to ensure our neighborhood remains safe and welcoming." A few heads nodded up front, her usual crowd. Karen paused, adjusting her sunglasses dramatically. "But recently, I was the victim of a dangerous and deliberate act, one that has caused me considerable physical harm, emotional trauma, and fear for our community's safety." I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste blood. She pushed on. "On the afternoon of June 10th, I was inspecting the property at 214 Willow Bend Lane. That's my house," I said, mostly for the crowd's benefit. Karen ignored me. "When I was exposed to hazardous plant material without warning or consent, a toxic pepper disguised among regular vegetables. She let that hang in the air, long enough for some whispers to stir. I was injured," she said, quieter now, "and I live in fear knowing such reckless behavior is happening right under our noses." There was a long pause. Then, finally, the floor was mine. I stood, slow and deliberate, and carried my laptop to the projector. I didn't say much, just loaded the files, pressed play, and stepped aside. The room went still. There was Karen, clear as day, slipping through my gate in her pink Crocs and gardening gloves. There she was, plucking tomatoes off the vine like she was shopping at a farmer's market. And there she was again, taking a bite of the reaper and launching herself backward like she'd swallowed a grenade. Gasps. Laughter. Margaret's quiet cough barely covered what sounded suspiciously like a snort. When the clip ended, I glanced at Karen. Her lips were pressed so tight they were nearly white. I folded my arms. "Any questions?" The silence after the video cut was thick enough to choke on. For a long second, no one moved. Karen sat frozen behind her stack of papers, her hands clenched so tightly around the edges that her knuckles had gone bone white. I stood there, waiting, letting the moment settle like dust after a demolition. And then Margaret cleared her throat. Everyone turned. She sat straight-backed in her usual chair, still scribbling neatly in her meeting minutes notebook, as if this was just another Tuesday, not the beginning of a coup. But when she spoke, her voice was clear, steady, and just loud enough to carry through the stunned quiet. "I saw her," Margaret said. 3 times, maybe more. Karen walked into his garden. She picked the tomatoes herself. The air shifted. It was subtle, but I felt it. People straightened in their chairs. Some exchanged glances, small nods passing between them, like signals in a secret language. Margaret kept writing, calm as ever, but her words had cracked the foundation Karen had built this whole farce on. Karen's head snapped toward her. "Margaret!" she hissed, low and warning, but the damage was already done. "I wrote it down," Margaret added without looking up. "For the records." Karen's face flushed an angry shade, and she scrambled to regain control. She yanked open a folder from her pile and held up a packet of papers like it was a weapon. "This," she announced, "is an expert report from a certified horticulturist. These peppers violate local agricultural safety codes. They are classified as hazardous flora under municipal guidelines." She slapped the papers down on the table. This entire garden could be subject to legal action. There was a ripple of uncertainty. Karen's supporters leaned forward, sensing an opening. I could see them waiting to jump on the idea, ready to turn the tide back in her favor. But I was ready. I pulled a thinner file from my backpack, flipping it open to the first page. "That's funny," I said, keeping my voice even, "because I spoke to the county extension office myself, and the Department of Agriculture. Carolina reapers aren't classified as hazardous. They're listed as edible crops." I held up a document, complete with a notary stamp. "This is the official statement." I moved to the next page. "And here's the HOA bylaw, Section 14, Paragraph 3. Home gardens are permitted within the community so long as they don't obstruct common areas or property lines." I looked around. My garden does neither. There wasn't a sound from Karen's side of the room. I closed the folder slowly. She entered my property without permission. She stole produce from my garden, and then she claimed to be a victim. Karen was crumbling. I could see it in the way her shoulders rounded in the desperate way her fingers fumbled with her sunglasses. She was scrambling for a defense she no longer had. And this time, no one was going to save her. Karen resigned the following week. The email came through at 7:03 a.m. sharp, blasted out to every homeowner in the neighborhood mailing list. It was curt, overly formal, and riddled with passive-aggressive phrasing, but it got the point across. Due to recent health concerns and the need for personal reflection, Karen was stepping down as HOA president effective immediately. There was no mention of the hearing, no reference to her spectacular downfall in front of a room full of neighbors, but we all knew why. She was finished. By the end of the day, her house was eerily quiet. No more morning patrols, no more measuring tapes. Princess still barked at the mailman, but the usual scrutiny, the peering over fences, the clipboard at the ready, vanished overnight. It was like a tight knot had finally been cut loose. The board scheduled elections within 2 weeks. Nobody was surprised when Margaret threw her name in. Fewer people were surprised when she won, almost unanimously. She ran on something she called reasonable leadership, which sounded boring on paper, but after years of Karen's reign, it felt revolutionary. The first meeting under Margaret's watch was quick, clean, and nobody got fined for having the wrong shade of mulch. It was strange at first, the quiet. After so many months of watching my back, waiting for another orange violation notice to show up taped to my door, I had to remind myself it was over. Nobody cared if my tomato cages weren't symmetrical. Nobody threatened me over the length of my grass. And the gardens, they exploded. Not just mine, but everybody's. Jerry put in a raised bed along his side yard, bright with sunflowers and sweet corn. Mrs. Becker, who hadn't so much as hung a flower basket before, started growing peppers, bell, jalapeno, and something else that looked suspiciously spicy. Even Jenkins planted a row of tomatoes in matching pots, as if daring someone to tell him he couldn't. As for me, I kept things simple. My reapers grew right alongside the heirlooms and cherries, just like they always had. I tended them in the early mornings and late afternoons, when the sun was soft and the world was quiet. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about peace, about the slow, steady rhythm of planting, watering, waiting. One morning, I knelt down in the dirt, pressing a few new seedlings into the soil. Tiny things, fragile and green, but full of promise. My hands worked on autopilot, dirt under my nails, sweat on my brow, and I smiled. Not because I'd won, not because Karen was gone. I smiled because, in the end, all I ever wanted was to grow tomatoes.